What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Chapter 10, the Mediterranean Society, the Greek Phase. You already know a couple of things, or at least four things in particular, about the Greeks, and we're going to kind of highlight them here. Number one, Alexander the Great invaded India. So we know that he comes from the Greek area, and he's going to invade India through the Khyber Pass, which we'll touch on more as we go along. We know that the Greeks traded with India. We know that they were close enough to trade, and we talked a little bit about the monsoons last time, is how they were able to make it all the way to the Mediterranean. Greece was a slave-based society. I really want you to take that home, that the entirety of Greece was built pretty much on the backs of slaves, and by this process they were able to do many amazing things. Basically because when you have slaves and you don't care about how they feel, or you don't really care that much about what happens to them, you can make them do a lot of amazing things, and you get a lot of labor done because it's not people you have to pay, and you can do it very cheaply. And finally, Greek historians commented on India. They were actually well understood with India, and they knew enough about it to actually start commenting on it and talking about it, which shows us that they were very aware of some of the things that were happening in India. Here's a picture of classical Greece. You can see to the far north, like northwest area with Macedon, that's where Alexander comes from. We see Mount Olympus, that's where the gods supposedly live. They're a little bit south of Macedon. You can see like all of the Sea of Crete, the Aegean Sea, Anatolia, which would be like modern day like Turkey, or like what we'll eventually call like the Byzantine area. We'll see the island of Rhodes, of Crete. So you can see all of how this kind of spread out. And then we have two societies I really want to highlight. First, the Mycenaean Society and the Minoan Society, which the Minoan Society basically found itself on the island of Crete. The early development of Greek society, the Minoan Society, it was basically the island of Crete, and their major city was Knossos. And one of the things about Knossos was that it was a center of maritime trade around 2200 B.C.E. And they had this very specific like writing in which we call the Linear A script, and it's still hard for us even today, and many scholars have not been able to decipher it or translate it into other languages that we're able to read. Then we know that it was in decline. The Minoan Society, after a series of natural disasters around 1700 BCE, there were earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, eventually some tidal waves, some foreign invasions, and Crete falls under foreign domination. So we saw the rise of Minoan Society and the fall of Minoan Society in 2 slides. Pretty easy, huh? Mycenaean Society had Indo-European invaders descend through the Balkans into Peloponnesus around 2200 BCE. They influenced the Minoan culture. You can see how close they are relatively. And the good thing about Greece and the Greek areas that we're going to kind of talk about is that it's a series of islands, and on that map you don't really get a full scale of how big those islands probably were or are to this day, but you can actually kind of see within it like this whole idea of being able to island hop or jump around a little bit, and you wouldn't have to travel very far. So even though back in those days seafaring was a very daunting task, and many, I would say very few cultures actually embarked upon it, one of the things that was nice, though, was that in the Sea of Crete, for example, and in the areas surrounding Greece, you can actually start to see some culture, or some of the people from Greece jumping around from island to island, stopping, refueling, and it wasn't that far away. You can, in some instances, see the island that you were heading to, and you could have a very easy trip making it there without having to worry about like thunderstorms or like hurricanes or anything like that that might hurt your society. Their major settlement, Mycenae, it ends up being kind of like the capital city, the start of the capital city, and there's military expansion throughout the region. We're going to see this text a lot throughout our study of AP World. Military expansion throughout the region. When you have your military, and you expand your military, and you expand your military within your region, you're exerting cultural, political, social, all different kinds of influence on those places. If you think about it, in the way that America is set up, you have kind of this like cultural influence that comes because America is so large. If you think about the places in the world that American military is based, like for example in Germany, there's a base in Ramstein, Germany. In the area of Ramstein, Germany, they have English bars and people speak English, and a lot of what happens in and around Ramstein is American centered. And because our military is stationed where it is, we exert a lot of cultural, political, social influence on that area of the globe. Now, if you take this back throughout history, you're going to see some people who basically are exerting their influence by having their military station in certain places. If you're in, for example, Mycenae, and you're a soldier, and then you get sent out to one of the edges of your society, well, when you get there, you're going to want some of the same food, you're going to want some of the same religion, maybe some cultural centers, maybe some people to speak the same way you do. And by having your military expand out, you're going to influence the people that already live there into being more like you. There's chaos in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the Trojan War. Around 1200 BCE, it's highlighted in Homer's Iliad. It's a very famous story about Achilles and his fight, and Achilles is fighting and trying to basically have this great war between the Trojan peoples, and Achilles is famous for his Achilles heel because he gets stabbed, he gets an arrow through it, and he basically, it's his one weak spot. And in the sequel, the Odyssey, is the story of one of those soldiers trying to make it home, and the crazy adventures that he goes on. You probably have read that in freshman year, or maybe if you didn't read it in freshman year, something you should probably pick up just kind of as a cultural touchstone. There's a ton of movies, a ton of different parts of our society that reference the Odyssey. One that comes to mind is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The movie basically rips off the entire Odyssey to try and highlight that story. Political turmoil and chaos from 1100 to 800 BCE, and the Mycenaean civilization just disappears through this political turmoil and chaos. After that, we end up arriving at this thing called the Polis. Where the Polis it stands for city-state. Now, a city-state is different than a city because it influences its reach beyond the city walls and also beyond what really it claims as its own land. So, for example, a city-state, for example, if we were to take Los Angeles. Now, we live in Los Angeles County, for those of you that go to my school. Within Los Angeles County, there are other cities, but there are also different ethnicities and different cultures and all those things. And by having a city-state, the kind of parallel here is in Los Angeles County, if they pass a law at the county level, that affects not only the cities of Cerritos or Bellflower or Artesia or those kind of things. What it actually starts to influence is all the cities within that county. Now, it's a state because, for example, in California where we are, we have a state, which is California, that oversees the local counties and cities. And we don't get to really make laws that either contradict or really kind of give two different answers to law questions. But within the city-state, you're allowed to have different laws and different types of rulings that are independent of others. So, for example, in the city-state of Sparta, for example, the people of Sparta would vote for their leaders, make different laws for themselves, run their city the way they wanted, and the larger area around them of the Greek peoples and that fallen Mycenaean society, they're not really going to be able to tell them what they can and can't do within their city or even within the areas that they claim as their own. It was an urban center, just like what we studied before in the past, where these were large groups of people that had banded together to form walls and cities. And so there was trade happening there, there was military station there were laws being passed and schools and sort of things, and they were dominating the surrounding rural areas. So not only was the influence of the city-state felt within the walls, it was also felt around in the rural areas where the farming was done, or even in the hills where nomads and shepherds were doing stuff, and they claimed almost direct control for those areas. It had a highly independent character. They were monarchies. Now, monarchies means ruled by a king. They were known as tyrannies, and now tyrannies doesn't necessarily mean tyrannical. Now, tyrannical has a very negative connotation in the way that we understand it today, but in the past, tyrannical didn't have to be oppressive. What it could be more is that the leader had supreme authority for all decisions. Now, within this monarchy tyranny system, let's say we elected a leader like myself. Now, the people would have a say in some of the decisions, but at the end of the day, the monarch or the tyranny would be able to decide what really happened, and there was no checks, no balances, no power structure that really went against what the monarch want. This is good in a number of ways because, number one, if you have one strong leader who's a very good leader who knows what he wants, he's going to help the people out, make sure everything works out well. This is bad in a number of ways because if you have a crazy leader or a leader who isn't really caring what the people want, you're going to have people who end up kind of hurting the society and maybe even hurting those who they have been sworn to protect. There also is, under the Polis, the start of what would be known as early democracies. Then democracy is like the rule of the people, democracy. And what it has to do is that the people are able to exert their voice through the power of the vote. So like laws, for example, in a democracy would be voted on. If you think about my classroom, this isn't really run as a democracy because if I allowed you to vote on things, then democracy would work because people would be allowed to do whatever the majority wants. But this kind of leads to a problem because let's say a majority of people vote that we should kick out all the other people for whatever reason. You can make two groups in your head, and let's say group A wants to kick out group B. Well, that's going to end up being a problem because it doesn't respect the rights of the minority or the smaller group. And so these early democracies work well enough in some ways, they fail in others, and we're going to really talk about this a little later. Next up, we have the city-state of Sparta. Now, Sparta is very famous for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a highly militarized society. Sparta saw itself as being like an army state, a government of the army. The subjugated peoples, or helots, were serfs that were tied to the land. And so in this society, the Spartans would go out, conquer people, and then through that conquering, they would capture a lot of people and basically make them slaves into helots. And these serfs were tied to the land in the fact that they had to work for the people of Sparta and growing their food, while the Spartan men, the citizens of Sparta, actually went out and fought more people. So this works out pretty well because if you think about it, you don't have to focus your society to be really balanced. You can have a group of people who their main job is just stabbing people and going around and capturing people. Through this process, you're going to pick up some people who could basically end up going out and getting people who could farm. And by doing that process, you're going to have people who will be able to feed your populations, which means that you don't have to devote more time to farming and agriculture and stuff. You just threaten to kill them if they don't grow your food the right way. There is a problem that ends up happening. The serfs, or the helots, actually outnumber the Spartans 10-1 by the 6th century B.C.E., and the military society developed to control the threat of rebellion. Is this balance to make sure that that larger group of people, those serfs, are not going around and trying to revolt because you have the swords, you're very militarized. So if you're the ones that are going out and stabbing people and capturing people, well, now that you're highly militarized, they're not going to want to revolt because you are well funded, you are well trained, you're just a better group of people who, with less people, you will fight off the rebellions. In Spartan society, austerity was the norm. Now, austerity means like plain, simple, very not ostentatious. Ostentatious would be over the top or crazy. So that austerity of like just simple lives, very simple food, very simple way of doing things. They had a very specific way of training their society. First off, the boys would be removed from their families at the age of 7, and they would be receiving military training in barracks. So they would actually take the boys away, put them in barracks, and they would teach them how to fight. For Spartan boys, the stories go that the Spartan boys would fight all day. They'd learn to wrestle, they'd learn to sword fight, they'd learn to hold their shield, they'd learn to do ranks, like move into certain positions. They knew how to run, they knew how to hike, they knew how to march, and this whole thing was geared to not giving them an education as we would understand it, but an education in fighting, so that by the time they grew up and were able to join the army, they would have active military service following that process, and they would have been the world's most trained army for its time, the ones that were able to go out and fight in an organized fashion. In the histories that we've studied, very few armies actually spent the time of like training their soldiers. Many times it was actually easier to just do something like get all your army from the people that were there. So you would say as a king, okay, all you farmers who are out there doing stuff, there's people that are going to attack us. I'm going to give you all swords. Let's go out and fight them. And when we beat them, we'll have all their stuff and you'll protect your land. It was advantageous for you to go out and fight because you're protecting your family and your homeland. Yeah, you might die, but you might die if you just sit at home too. Whereas with Spartan Society, you were fully aware of what you were kind of getting into. By the time you probably reached 8, you knew that your life was going to be about fighting. And since your life is going to be about fighting, why not get a lot of training that led you to be the better fighter? If you're fighting as a Spartan against a bunch of peasants around the world, you're going to have a way better system of organization, moving your troops around. The tactics that they would be able to employ by moving troops would work out way better than any just group of farmers trying to defend themselves. So you really didn't have to worry so much about attacks and violence. They'll eventually get to marry, but they don't have a home life until age 30 when they were allowed to retire from the army. So they were allowed to go home to Sparta. If you made it to 30, if you didn't get killed in battle, then you were allowed to stay at home, relax, and maybe even get a job and train the next group of soldiers. There's relaxation of the discipline by the 4th century CE. So around the 4th century CE, we see that they stop doing this whole removing boys system, and they stop focusing heavily on having an active military as a part of their culture. And it's not a complete withdrawal, but it is a relaxation. Now this is in contrast to the city-state of Athens. They are the first to develop an early form of democracy. Now, when I talk about democracy, we're talking about the voice of the people or the rule of the people, but I don't want you to think about it in democracy in the way we would talk about in America. We're not a democracy in America, we're a democratic republic. Now, a democratic republic means we vote for elected leaders who go out and then make decisions for us. In a true democracy, we would vote for everything. And so there's a very famous example through this documentary I was watching once where they have these little discs, and on one side, you would pinch it between your fingers, and inside of this disc was either a hole or not a hole. And so by pinching it with your fingers, you were hiding the little hole that's inside of the disc. Now, you would throw it into the pot and when they would take votes on things, and then they would count all the ones with no's, which would be the holes, and the ones with yes, which would be the ones without holes. And what you would do is figure out what we should do. Now, with democracy, the idea within Athens was that all free adult males were allowed to vote. So if you were free, meaning you weren't a slave, if you were an adult, meaning you were above a certain age, and if you were male, meaning not a girl or a woman, you would be allowed to vote and have your voice heard. You can see how this is a very not fair or not egalitarian process, but at the same time, you can understand where they're coming from because in their society, they had built the society around this idea that those who only should get a say are the ones who have the most to lose. The free adult males are the ones with property. They're the ones who have the most to lose based on certain decisions, and they're the ones who are having to protect others. As a patriarchy is established within the Greek society, you need to have a system where the paterfamilias, or the father, can actually take care of the others that he's put under his charge, like his wife, his children, such. Women and slaves were excluded from this process. Yet, you can contrast this Athenian-style government with the Spartan militarism. With Sparta, there wasn't really a vote. You're in the army if you're a boy and you're a soldier. And again, this comes back to that thing of you have the most to lose. As a male, if you made it to 30, you had to have a Sparta to retire to. And the best way to protect your Sparta and your beloved city is to fight. And if you can fight and kill all the other people before they kill you, you have a really good chance of making it to retirement. And again, this isn't the way we would think today, but you can understand where being strong and protecting what's yours actually leads them to their understanding in Sparta. And in Athens, they don't really focus so much on the militarism. They believe that we should vote, we should use our reason, we should use our intellect, we should use our mind to figure out, okay, what should we do next? Within Athenian society, maritime trade begins increasing prosperity beginning in the 7th century BCE. Now, maritime in the ocean, they're trading, they're getting some prosperity. Remember those little islands I talked about they were able to hop around on? It's great because you can stop, you can drop off some supplies, pick up new supplies, go all around, and through that trading, you're going to gain a surplus of goods, and also you're able to kind of trade at larger distances because you're not making such a huge jump across the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea. You're going to be able to trade as far as, for example, India, when the Indians show up because of the monsoons and such. There are aristocrats that dominate small landowners. There's going to be a problem that arises within Athenian society, is that a small group of aristocrats or land-owning, very rich people start to dominate the smaller farms that are in the area. And what ends up happening is that there's going to come a point where there's this class conflict. Now, this is the first time class conflict has shown up in our class, and I kind of want to highlight it a little more than I normally would. Socioeconomics is the study of how society is affected by economics or money, and there's going to be this tension between the rich and the poor. With this specific example, the rich are the landed aristocrats. Now, the rich landed aristocrats have a lot of power and a lot of influence because they own a lot of land. And by owning a lot of land, they're able to have lots of food and grain and grapes, for example, and olives to grow on their land, which allows them to get lots of money because when they go to market or they trade or whatever, they're going to get a lot of return on investment. Now, the problem with this is because, for example, if a landed aristocrat had 10 acres of land and you were a small landowner that only had 1 acre of land, well, every year when the harvest came in, he's going to make 9 times more harvest than you are, meaning he's going to be 9 times richer than you are, and that's going to happen year after year after year. And then as the rich get richer and the poor pretty much stay the same, the rich are going to be able to take that excess amount of money and go out and buy smaller land. So maybe your neighbor who's not really having a good year in his crops might sell his land to the man who had 10 acres. Now the very rich man has 11 acres. And as a way to keep the farm going, that rich aristocrat might pay your neighbor to just stay on the land and keep working it, but he has to give up all his crop to the landed aristocrat, and they'll make them even more richer. So when the next year comes, now he's making 10 times more than you are. This process is going to continue until there are a very small group of aristocrats or very rich people in a very privileged position in the society are able to basically take over the entire farming areas, and they're going to make tons of money. If you own pretty much all the land that grows the wheat and you want bread, you're going to have to buy the wheat from the person who owns all that stuff. And if there's no other option to buy wheat from anyone else, you're going to be stuck paying whatever price they decide you're going to pay. This is where we get to the aristocrat Solon and the Athenian democracy. Solon mediates the crisis, which means he figures out a way to make everyone unhappy, basically. He doesn't make one group happy and the other group happy. He just makes everyone kind of not as pissed off, but more pissed off in general. Aristocrats are going to keep large land holdings, but the debts, for example, in that aristocrat example that I gave, let's say that you were kept on to farm the aristocrat's land. Well, maybe he says, okay, you need to farm, and last year this farm grew 100 bushels of wheat, for a simple example. But this is a bad year, and you're only able to grow 50 bushels of wheat. Well, he said you were supposed to grow 100. Now you owe him another 50. So you just now are in debt, even though you sold your land off, right? And that debt might grow year after year after year because you're never going to be able to pay it back. And that means that you're going to be stuck under, basically like as a slave to those very rich aristocrats. So Solon argues that the aristocrats should be allowed to keep their land, all the land that they've bought or sold, and that those who are living on the land, they should have their debts forgiven, which means that whatever is owed to those large landowners are null and void, they're gone. And he's now going to say that you're no longer allowed to keep somebody as a debt slave. So if you were one of those people that owed 50 bushels of wheat through your debt, well, now you're free and you can't be kept as a slave just because you owe some money to a very rich person. He also removed family restrictions against participating in public life. In the past, you had to have like this whole thing of like having a family to participate in public life because you had to have like your debt to society maintained, meaning that you had to actually take care of a group of people like children and women, which made you more valuable. And so instead, if you didn't have a family, you were still allowed to like participate in public life, like voting and participating in certain parts of the government. And finally, he instituted paid civil service. This is a very interesting and great part of the world history that we look at. Paid civil service, in the past, people had jobs, and maybe those jobs were more like a contractor base. So if the government needed lawyers, they would go out and hire some lawyers and then get them to do the job, and then they'd stop doing that job. But if the lawyers didn't have any other clients besides the government, they might starve because the government doesn't need them all the time. This is an exchange where through paid civil service, there is a group of people that's job is paid for by taxation to represent the people or to protect the people or to do certain things within the government for the people, because the people need those services all the time. And it helps both sides in a certain way. It makes things better for those who are doing the public service because they have a guaranteed job. Now you are, for example, a tax collector. Your job once a year is to go out and collect the taxes and bring the taxes to the government. Well, you know that every year you're going to get paid, or all the time you're going to get paid, or however long it takes you to do your job, and that makes you happy because now you have a stable job. This is opposed to, for example, in the past when they would hire out tax collectors to go and collect money, and then once they collected the money, they were kind of out of a job after they were done collecting the money. This also helps the government because they're able to go have a go-to set of people. Sometimes if you need like 20 people to go collect taxes, well, if you don't have 20 people who want to do the job or can't get away from farming or whatever, you kind of can't do what you want to do. Whereas with the paid civil service, you're saying, okay, these 20 people, your job is to collect taxes. You have to go and collect the taxes whenever and bring the taxes back. And that meant that the government could run efficiently, didn't have to scrounge for people, and it had made sure that people who were going to collect the taxes knew what they were doing, they were professionals at their job, and they were able to do it in a way that was very efficient for all involved. We then get to Pericles. He rules from 461 to 429 B.C.E. This is the high point of Athenian democracy. He was an aristocrat, but he was popular, namely because he instituted massive public works. If you're going to be a good leader, sometimes you need to just build some stuff that helps everyone. If you think about, for example, in our area, we have a big library across the street at Cerritos. That's a public work. It doesn't really benefit the person who built it necessarily by themselves, and it doesn't benefit just the people of Cerritos. It benefits like everybody who comes there and wants a book. So if you're a resident of Cerritos, one of the benefits of living there is the ability to go to that library and study there, use the computers, check out books, do all the cool things that are in that library. And by doing these massive public works, the people say, hey, that guy's not a bad guy because at least we got this building or this thing out of them being in charge. And through Pericles, he encouraged cultural development, like in the arts, architecture, all different kinds of plays, those sorts of things. And by encouraging it, we mean he gives some money to, or he builds new stadiums, like amphitheaters, where people could perform plays, yada, yada, yada. Here's an example of some of the massive public works. You can see this is like a temple, and inside of that temple, you would go and worship. So, for example, if you were the government and you built a giant temple to the gods or to a god, well, now you're getting the people to say, hey, now we have a place to go and worship the god or the gods, and now that's cool because now the gods will be happy with us. And so thanks, leader, for building us this awesome building that we can do things in. Here's an example of our modern day America. This is actually outside the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. You can see how the columns, for example, match the similar style. And the reason that is because we get in America a lot of our foundations of democracy, our understanding of the ideas of equality, justice, freedom from the Greeks who started tinkering around with those ideas. And our Western tradition of looking at the world comes directly from the Greeks. And so to honor them, we built our buildings in many parts of America to kind of replicate that. Greek colonization. There is population expansion, drives colonization. As you have more people through agriculture, through bureaucracy, through being able to run a government efficiently, you're going to have people who make more people through babies. And this is going to drive to colonization, which means going out and taking over people's stuff and planting your flag, or, I mean, they didn't have flags back then, but planting your influence and dominance on them. Throughout the coastal Mediterranean, the Black Sea, we get the cities of Sicily, Naples, Neapolis, which means new city. Throughout southern France, we get Massalia or Marseille, Anatolia, southern Ukraine. All these fall under the Greek influence. Here's the classical Greece in the Mediterranean basin between 800 and 500 BCE. Look at all the little red dots down in there. I can see, for example, Byzantium, Cyrene, Neapolis, Saguntum. You can see all these different little Syracuse, Greek cities that are dotting all over this Mediterranean. One of the reasons, strategic advantage. If you have a city that you're going to, a center of trade, you have a kind of a destination, and you know people will be there ready to trade for you. You also have kind of outposts for your military to be stationed to watch the borders to keep all the people that are in the middle more safe. And you also have like a new group of people that are maybe growing different things, or they're like creating different things. And so you have a lot of like a larger trade network of goods and services you can cull from. The effects of Greek colonization, there's trade throughout the region. This works out really well for the Greeks because they're able to trade between themselves, but also if you were from the outside parts of that Greek kind of section, you would be able to come into the Greek cities and trade with the Greeks, maybe some things they didn't have, like spices or goods, whatever. They also get to communicate ideas. Again, this goes back to when I talked about the Silk Road. The things that were being traded on the Silk Road were not just goods. They were also ideas. They were also language, religion, culture, arts, like all different kinds of things that we wouldn't normally associate with trade. But if you have a bunch of people kind of together and they're kind of sitting around after trading their goods, well, maybe they'll share their religion, or maybe they share their like new scientific discoveries from the area they're from, or maybe they're trading some of the like ideas that like their philosophers are talking about. And those are things that people kind of pick up on and see it as a cool new way. I mean, think about when you came to school for the first time, or maybe the thing I always remember is when you sit down at like lunch, right? So if you remember in elementary school, your mom and dad made you lunch a very specific way. Some of you, it was like a sandwich, right? You got turkey, you got cheese, you got ham or whatever, and it's packed between two pieces of bread. But then you come to like a school in Cerritos, and maybe you're sitting next to somebody who has spam musubi, right? Something you've never seen before. Or maybe you're sitting next to some kid, and he pulls out a bunch of lupia, like those little tiny like egg roll things like from the Philippines. And it might blow your mind, but if you try one, you might like it, and now your culture has been shifted, or you've shared your culture. And maybe to them, your sandwich might be like super weird. Why would you take two pieces of bread and just put some meat in between it? Why wouldn't you make spam musubi or whatever? This is like a very simple understanding of how like culture is traded, but you can understand that even way back when people pull out their lunch, figure it out. Kind of cool, huh? Political and social effects. Politics, the idea of democracy itself spreads. You let everybody in your society vote on things? Wow, that's amazing. We should do that. There's also social effects. Social effects, like if you think about how society is organized, the bureaucracy system gets spread through this way. Oh, so leaders meet other leaders and say, so how do you control your empire? Oh, well, we do this, that, and the other. Oh, that's really cool. Let's trade those ideas. Here is an example of the Greek alphabet. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, xi, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, tau, epsilon, phi, chi, psi, omega. If you look very close, you can see that there is a very, very, very close similarity to many of the letters we use today, especially alpha, beta, epsilon, zeta, eta. You get the whole idea, right? Now, these Greek letters will eventually lead to what we will use as like the Greek alphabet system that we base our letters off of in English. So that cultural idea of those shapes are still to this day being used. And so without them, we wouldn't really be using the same letters that we use for English. Also, just kind of a cultural note, make sure you know like alpha being first and omega meaning last. Many of these letters have like dual meanings. So for example, delta means like 4 in a lot of places, and alpha means like first, and beta means 2, and omega means last, the last of something. And when you get to college, you're going to have Greek letters, Greek organizations. You can look them up because you'll, for example, have like Kappa, Kappa, Mu. I don't know. Pick a fraternity, figure it out. But they all have different letters, and that's the way that sororities and fraternities organize themselves along, like usually 3-letter Greek alphabet names. The Persian Wars are from 500 to 479 CE. There's a revolt against the Persian Empire in 500 BCE in Ionia. Athens supports with ships. The Greek rebellion is crushed by Darius in 493 BCE. Athenians rout the Persian army in 490 BCE. And the successor Xerxes burns Athens, but's driven out as well. This is just kind of like the bullet points of that war. The Delian League. So all the different Greek city-states get together. The Polis, get it? Create the Delian League to forestall more Persian attacks. So they're really afraid of Persia coming in. They're led by Athens because Athens, again, known as like the reason people, the people with the knowledge. They make there are massive payments to Athens. They fuel the Periclean expansion. They're resented by the other polis, meaning that like the Athenians get a lot of money through this Delian League, and it's like a very base form of like what we would understand as like the United States. Now I say that only because like if you think about the United States, like Missouri, Texas, California, those are like separate states with separate people who have like separate ideas, but they can kind of all get together and say like we don't want to get invaded by say Canada. And so we should stick together, and if Canada wants to invade us, then Texas and Missouri, you should help out California, and vice versa and all around. But we'd still have to pick like a leader or a certain city or state to be in charge. And so with the Delian League, they pick Athens. And so Athens gets a lot of taxes and money basically to go and try and like prevent another invasion from the Persians. Yet they use a lot of this money to kind of enhance themselves, enhance their wealth. And the other polis kind of look at it and say like, man, this is not a good system. This is going to lead us to the Peloponnesian War. The polis are going to fight one another. It's a civil war in Greece from 431 to 404 BCE. The polis either allied with Athens or Sparta. Now, you can see that this has kind of always been heading in this direction. The city-states, while at the same time are trying to protect one another and come from the same basic people groups, they're not really on the same page. Athens and Sparta especially, they have one group that's like highly dedicated war, stab first, ask questions later. They have Athens highly dedicated to reason, able to kind of talk their way out of a lot of things. The polis are going to either choose to ally with Athens or Sparta, and as you might expect, Athens is going to be forced to surrender. Sparta has been pretty much dominating their areas that they try and take over because they're stronger. They spend their whole lives training just to stab people. And when you spend your whole lives just training to stab people, you're going to get pretty good at stabbing people. And the conflict that continued between Sparta and other polis eventually leads to some issues later on. We're going to get to the Kingdom of Macedon. It's the frontier region north of Peloponnesus, so like the northish area. There's King Philip II. He rules from 359 to 336 BCE. He builds a massive military, and in 350, he encroaches on the Greek polis to the south, and he controls the entire Greek region of the polis by 338 BCE. This is where we get Alexander of Macedon. Alexander the Great, son of Philip II. Rapid expansion throughout the Mediterranean basin. Because of his success in taking over the Greek areas, he's going to continue out of Macedon through the Greek city-states, pressing outward all the way into Persia, and he actually invades Persia successfully, taking over Persia. He turns back in India when his troops are exhausted, basically saying, we're not going to go another step, we're going home, man, this is ridiculous. And Alexander, probably one of the greatest military minds in the history of the world, using superior techniques, better trained army, better technology, just all around better, and it was just shocking he didn't completely take over the world. Without his troops mutinying, I highly doubt he would have stopped at any point, barring his death. His empire stretches all of this yellow area. Look at how far this stretches out. We go all the way to like the edges of the Punjab region where they gave up. We look at the Hindu Kush Mountains, Bactria, Persia, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Macedonia. He pressed all the way down into Egypt. And this is going to be what is known as the known world during his time. He spread all the way out, and he knew that he could probably have kept going, and by all accounts, he probably would have, had it not been for his soldiers mutinying. And if you look at his route, you can see some of the arrows of where he took, how he spread all around. It was just fascinating to look at his just journey of just going everywhere. If you were one of his soldiers and look at all that ground you covered, you probably would have gave up to by the time that his troops do. This is where we get to the Hellenistic Empires. Alexander, like I said, dies. Some accounts say he drank himself to death, basically partying it up because there was nothing else to do. Some just say he kind of like died of like some diseases. But for whatever reason, Alexander dies, and there's competition for his empire. That's a large empire with lots of money, lots of just like influence, power. And so what ends up happening is it's divided by his generals. Antigonus gets Greece and Macedon. Ptolemy, the P is silent, gets Egypt. Seleucus gets the Persian Achaemenid Empire. It's going to be split amongst his generals in this way, and for a very long time during the Classical Age and even beyond, these are going to be the ruling families of those specific areas. And for example, the Ptolemies, we get all the way to like the end of the start of the Roman Empire with Caesar Augustus and the last Ptolemaic Empress, Cleopatra. They have economic integration and intellectual cross-fertilization. Even though they were split up, they still were trading, they still were sharing ideas, there were still lots of people kicking around different things between one another. And this works out well because these Hellenistic empires are able to share and grow together even though they're separate. In the Antigonid Empire, the smallest of the Hellenistic empires, there was local dissent. There was an issue of land distribution and heavy colonizing activity. People kept showing up, taking over stuff. Land was getting disputed over who owned what and where did it stop, yada yada. The Ptolemaic Empire, the wealthiest of the Hellenistic empires, because remember back to our chapter on Egypt. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. It is known as being a very fertile region, being able to grow lots of food, lots of bread. Even though it's a desert, you still get a ton of food there. They established state monopolies, for example, on textiles. Egyptian cotton, to this day, is known as some of the finest cotton you can buy in the world, and that textile comes from there. Salt. Salt is a necessary component for life. Without salt, we all die, and we need salt to make our food taste good. And not only that, back then, there were no refrigerators, so if you killed a big old cow, for example, and you wanted to preserve its meat for longer than the day that you would maybe have a chance to eat it, you needed salt to cure it, to keep it from diseases, keep it from rotting. And beer. Beer, one of the greatest inventions in world history. Not because I personally like beer, but because beer does an amazing thing. Number one, it is able to be resistant to many germs and bugs and pests because it is highly alcoholic, and bugs like that and certain like animals don't like alcohol because it is a disinfectant. Germs, like within, like for example, water, grow very rapidly. If you've ever spit into a cup, or you've ever not cleaned a fish tank for a very long time, and you like let it grow, weird things start to grow in there, and that is not water you want to put into your body. So that alcohol content kills a lot of those germs, and calorie content. If you have a lot of wheat can go bad eventually, but if you're able to convert a lot of that wheat into alcohol, you retain a lot of the calories. Beer has a ton of calories. It's basically made from hops, barley, wheat, lots of like grain. They use yeast to basically drink up all the sugar, and when yeast drinks up all the sugar within it, it produces alcohol, and that alcohol is able to preserve a lot of it, and beer can last a very long time if kept at the right conditions. Same thing with high alcohol things. Also, beer is super cheap to make. For the amount of wheat that you use to make beer, you can get a lot of liquid out of it. You can use this liquid to feed some of your, for example, slaves. It's said that many of the slaves that worked on the pyramids were given a ration of beer at night. It's very high in calories, and it also has alcohol in it, meaning that they were very sleepy and probably didn't want to revolt. So beer, one of the greatest inventions in human history, isn't just for when you go to college. The capital of the Ptolemaic Empire is in Alexandria. It's an important port city, and it's named after Alexander. It has a major museum and library built there, big old lighthouse on top of it, and it's just known as one of the like wonders of the world. The city of Alexandria itself, just amazing. It's not like that today, but during the Ptolemaic Empire, it was one of the great parts of the world that everyone probably would have wanted to see if they knew it existed. Under the Seleucid Empire, there's massive colonization of Greeks, export of Greek culture, values as far east as India, as far as Bactria, and the Ashoka legislates in Greek and Aramaic. That's going to become fascinating when we get to like Aramaic, when we talk about a little bit more in the Middle East. But the Ashoka, that guy we learned about last chapter, actually makes laws and rulings and talks about his empire in the language of the people of Greece from the Mediterranean, hundreds of miles away. So it means that they were very much an integral part of the society. Trade and integration of the Mediterranean basin. Greece has a little grain, but rich in olives and grapes. Today, Greece is known for its olive oil and for its grapes, like its wine. Colonies further their trade. If you're growing lots of grapes and olives, and another region of the world is growing lots of grain, you can probably do a pretty good trade. Make sure you got some bread, they get some olive oil, they get some wine, everybody's happy, trade, trade, trade. Commerce, rather than agriculture, is a basis of much of the economy. This is kind of a shift. We've been talking a lot about how agriculture changes societies. Well, that does happen, but for the Mediterranean basin, this is actually going to shift a little bit because you don't need to have a very large, diverse agricultural base, you don't have to produce all the goods you want. You can trade it. If you specialize in olives, for example, and you make way too much olives than your society can use, you can take the excess and you can trade it away for things that you actually need. You can think about that, again, back to my lunch example. If you brought, for example, in your lunch, just bags and bags and bags of Oreos, I'm pretty sure by the end of the day, if you were smart enough, you could trade enough of those Oreos to get yourself a sandwich, maybe a soda, maybe a couple other things, and you don't have to actually bring all that stuff to the table. You can get it through trade. I like my lunch example. Panhellenic Festivals, useful for integrating far-flung colonies. These Panhellenic Festivals are great because it gives people a sense of pride within where they come from. If you're really far away from Greece, but you don't understand why the Greeks are in charge, but you still have to be kind to them and you still have to like kind of do all the things they say, what you need to do is have some sort of point of like pride that still keeps you, even though you're being ruled under. This is the start of like the Olympic Games. If you think about the modern Olympic Games, people from all over the world go to compete in different events, like running and shot put and throwing spears, javelins, that's the word I'm looking for. And by doing that, it creates a sense of identity because, for example, if China has like a weightlifter who can do more weightlifting than the American guy, then we give the Chinese guy the gold if he beats everyone else, and then that gives like pride from where you come from. And they're the best in the world at what they do for that moment, which is super cool. And it teaches people, like, you can be proud of where you come from, but you can still participate in, like, our society. And it creates a sense of collective identity. No longer are we just like an individual. Now we are like the Spartans, or we are like the Anatolians, or maybe we're like the Persians, whatever. Like, pick a group. And you can understand that even today. When the Olympics are on, many Americans feel a lot of pride in America. They cheer for American teams. They cheer for American athletes. This is all done to create like a bond. And this is great because that makes it so that people don't want to revolt all the time because they see it as like one big culture with keeping their identities within that culture. It was a patriarchal society. I'm sorry to say it. We're going to have this for a while. Women were viewed as goddesses, wives, or prostitutes. Now, you might think that only one of those things on the list is kind of bad, but in the way they looked at it was not so good. Goddesses, they're subservient to the gods, and many stories of the goddesses were actually very problematic. The goddesses were kind of jerks, and they really just spent most of their time tricking men, or they just screwed with the lives of humans. Wives, for example, in the Patriarchal Society, you were a wife. You might as well call them like basically a slave because you didn't get to have any choice, you didn't get to have a vote in anything, and you were seen as like property of your husband. And finally, prostitutes. If I have to explain that one, you maybe shouldn't be an AP of why that's a bad thing. Limited exposure in the public sphere. The women were not seen as being very valuable, and in public, specifically the laws, the government, the public life, you don't need to be a part of that. Sparta was the partial exception. Sparta did value its women. It did see them as almost egalitarian in a way because they saw them as valuable to keeping the home. As the men went off and fought, women's job was to protect the home front. Sappho, we'll skip that for now. Come back to the role of infanticide and Greek culture, society and culture. It's hard to understand, but within Greek society, specifically like Sparta, for example, the valuable parts of the society were the people who were able to defend its society. You were not seen as valuable individually, you were seen as valuable individually as what you brought to the whole. So if you were born, for example, with deformities, or you were born malnourished or something like that, you were just killed because there wasn't really any need for you, and the society did not view you as someone to be taken care of. They viewed you as a liability to their society. If we want to be a strong society, we need to get rid of the weak within our society. This is a horrible idea even to this day to think about, but you can understand where they're coming from using logic and reason. This is one of those examples in history where using logic and reason doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. And finally, Sappho, a Greek poet. She's seen as one of the great poets of Alexandria. Her work is pretty much lost to the world by now, but she's still seen as like a very influential person to the Greek society. And so there is women in places of authority and power, but at the same time, they're not viewed with much reverence. in a way. They might have some like small contributions that they make, but they're not really seen as being influential to the greater society. Now we get to the Greeks and their very strong fascination with slavery. They had Scythians from Ukraine, Nubians from Africa, and this was done as chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery is kind of a terrible thing within a society, but it's a little bit better than, say, the slavery of the Americas. Chattel slavery was you go around and you capture people, you make them your slaves, and then once they're done being your slaves, you might let them go. This is versus the lifetime slavery that was happening in the Americas, where they were generational slaves. So once a slave was born to a slave, that was your property now, and you got to own them forever until slavery basically ends in like 1865 at the end of the Civil War, and at different times throughout human history we've ended slavery in different parts of the world. But chattel slavery, not terrible, but it's still kind of bad. Like, you understand, like, owning other people is absolutely wrong, especially owning them for labor and not paying them. Sometimes slaves were used in business, like actually doing like bookkeeping or like law. There are famous examples throughout history of just like slaves who like even became like mathematicians. But many times throughout this slavery, they had an opportunity to buy freedom. You were a slave, for example, within the society, and after a certain amount of years, through your labor, you were able to go free. That's kind of good because you at least have an end date of when you had to do this. There wasn't like this life-crippling kind of ownership. It does, however, keep one thing down: rebellion. If you are a slave and you know you just have to work for like 10 years, that's not terrible. It's kind of like going to jail. You're not going to do anything because you know that if you revolt, that 10 years might turn into like 50 years, but at least you know that there's like a point at which you might have this all be done. So just work hard. And many slave owners in this area probably weren't terrible to their slaves. Like, they don't have like the whipping that we would associate with slavery in the Americas, but they weren't treated very nicely. The Greek language, they borrowed the Phoenician alphabet, they added vowels, and it's a complex language. We even use a lot of like Greek and Latin roots to this day in our words. Like, for example, we say the alpha, which is like the head, like I talked about before. Pi, you guys still know what pi is, 3.14159, blah, 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 blah. You get how their influence still affects us to this day. In science and mathematics, they use observable evidence and rational thought. This was mind-blowing, and you guys might not understand this right now, but there was a time at which it was just like, why does the sun come up? I don't know. Maybe there's a guy with like a chariot, and he rises to the sky, and he makes the sun come up. That was like their extent of understanding, because they kind of use the system of like, well, could you prove it's not a guy in the sky, like, running the sun across the sky? Well, then it's a guy running the sun across the sky, yada, yada, yada. But instead, the Greeks actually use science and mathematics, or like observable evidence. Like, so the sun moves in a very predictable pattern, and it's very far away. Maybe it doesn't need a guy in the sky like riding in front of it. Maybe it just does it on its own, and they would use scientific experiments. They also did things like rational thought. Maybe we could like use math to figure out like, okay, the sun was blocked out like at this time, and if we make a model of what we think the universe looks like, maybe we could predict when that eclipse happens again. And Thales predicts an eclipse on the 28th of May in 585 BCE. That's amazing. Without computers, without a working knowledge of the universe and how like the sun how the world orbits around the sun and all the other planets and the moon, he was still able to figure out there was going to be an eclipse, and then it happened. That's amazing. Democritus and Adams, that's going to be this guy who basically sits down and says the whole world is made up of tiny little things, and when you get to the tiniest level, you can't break them down anymore. That's what everything's made out of. And that blew everyone's mind, because if you think about it, you'd be very easily led to believe that like everything that is just a version of something else. Like, for example, my computer sitting in front of me is just a bunch of little parts, but where did all those little parts come from? And if we could go smaller and smaller and smaller, they thought there were just little versions of that. Like an apple, there's just millions and billions and trillions of little tiny apples that are making up an apple, or parts of an apple that make up an apple. So it wasn't the greatest way to look at atoms, but they at least started thinking about atoms. Pythagoras uses a systematic approach to mathematics. Many of you know the Pythagorean theorem is probably the bane of your existence in some math class somewhere. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Hippocrates is the human anatomy and physiology. He starts to look at the body and realizes that we all kind of have the same stuff in us. He starts to realize that there are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do, and there are certain things that you should do to keep yourself healthy. He is the father of medicine, and the Hippocratic Oath actually comes from his name, the whole do no harm thing. Then we get to Socrates. Socrates, interesting dude. Socratic method, basically reasoning, asking questions. He would ask big questions. We use Socratic method in a lot of our teaching at Cerritos for different teachers. So, like, for example, I ask my students when we talk about Greece in my regular CP class, what is freedom? And then they kind of take it and talk about it for a while until they can get to one solid answer, and then we ask questions about that solid answer, and we just keep asking questions and questions and questions until we've exhausted all the questions, and maybe we come to an answer, maybe we don't, but we keep just asking lots of questions. He'll eventually have a student named Plato. He was known as a public gadfly, someone who kind of went around acting a little crazy, very influential, very kind of misunderstood by the society at the time, and Socrates is condemned on charges of immorality. He was actually condemned on corrupting the youth. They thought that he was like making young people like weird, like by questioning authority and asking questions all the time. If you've ever been like, but why, to like any of your teachers or to your parents, that's kind of very Socratic of you. And so Socrates dies because he's forced to drink hemlock. This is kind of like a weird way to kill somebody. If you think about, they could have beheaded him, they could have like stabbed him, but instead, Socrates drinks hemlock, which is like a poison. And this is kind of like a nice way. He chose to die. This is like a very like enlightened way of looking at the world. Allowing someone to like take their own life rather than brutally have it forced from them. Plato goes on to systematize Socratic thought. We don't really have very much of like Socrates. We know what Plato said about Socrates and what he wrote about Socrates. And Plato will eventually make this awesome thing called the Republic. Now, the Republic is basically a system of government that he believed would be the best system in the world if ever it was enacted. He believed that they should have philosopher kings. There should be people at the top who are in charge, and they should be philosophers. Kind of a nice way to organize your society if you're a philosopher and you're the one who should be in charge. But Plato argues that these philosopher kings would have different jobs, and they would assign those who were good at, for example, like math, they would become like engineers and workers. Those who weren't good at math, they would do some other job. Like if you were good at PE, basically, you would become a soldier in the army. And if you were not good at either of those jobs, then you would be a farmer. So everybody has their place, and it was a very systematic approach. If you think about it today, when people ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? If you suck at math, you probably shouldn't be an engineer. And if you're really good at writing, you probably should do something where you can show off your writing skills. The Republic was the first time that they thought that everybody kind of has what they're good and what they're bad at, and we should highlight the strengths and downplay the negatives. Plato eventually will get to this thing called the theory of forms or ideas. It's a very complex idea, but the simplistic version is that the whole world and the whole universe is made up of things. And those forms or things are basically kept up in like a cloud somewhere. So when we think about the word like chair, you have a picture in your mind of a chair. I'm thinking about a chair, you're thinking about a chair, my grandpa is thinking about a rocking chair, whatever. Everybody's thinking about a chair. And there are things that at its essence a chair is. It has 4 legs, it holds people, you sit on it, yada yada yada. But everybody has different versions of a chair. So there must be a chair that like lives in the sky, not like for real, but like an idea of a chair that is like the perfect chair. And all our ideas that are about a chair come from the perfect version that comes from the sky into our brains. It's very complicated and not really useful all the time, but it is interesting for philosophical thought. And if you take Philosophy 101 in college, you'll get into that more and more. Aristotle is a student of Plato, broke with the theory of forms or ideas, and he argues that there's empirical findings and reason. He makes a massive impact on Western thought. This is the start of like contradiction. This is the start of people like arguing. Aristotle is going to say like, no, we need to look around and we should only believe what we can see. We should only believe what we can reason with our natural mind. We should not believe that the gods are up in the sky doing all these things. If we've never seen the gods, maybe they don't exist. He wasn't a straight-up atheist, but he was starting to ask questions that many people didn't necessarily like to question. And especially his emphasis on reason is going to lead to basically modern philosophy and all the way to any philosophy that takes place to this day. Next, we have the Greek theology. They were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods, each god having a different job. Zeus was known as the principal god, god of thunder and lightning. They also had many religious cults. For example, the Eleusinian Mysteries. Yeah, that's how you say that word. Eleusinian Mysteries. The mysteries were a series of rituals or events that kind of circled around this story of Persephone going to the underworld, being captured by Hades, and how she goes down to the underworld, how there's an ascent, and then there's a rejoining with her mother, and they kind of had this weird cult, as we would understand today, atmosphere where it was secretive, and there was lots of ritual to it, and there was this pattern of actions you had to do. I've read before that some scholars argue that in the way it was done, there might have been use of some sort of drugs. I know that for certain temples, for example, the Temple of the Oracle at Delphi, they have found underneath it a gas crack where methane gas would come out, or different types of gas from the earth, and that would maybe get the person high that was standing above it, allowing them to see visions. Whatever the reason you want to believe, the Eleusinian mysteries showed the religious cults had some power in how they proceeded to act out their religious practice. The Bacchae is a tragedy. It is about a god who comes down and he's pissed off at this king of a city because he's been slighted. They've been talking trash on him, and throughout the play he just gets mad and mad and mad, and eventually he destroys the whole city, kills the king, kicks all the people out, and it's known as one of the greatest tragedies of all time. Rituals will eventually become domesticated, meaning they're brought into the home, meant to be more personal, more one-on-one without the use of the temple, and also brought to be more acceptable to the public, not so creepy and weird. There's a tragic drama. This is where we get the idea of tragedy from. This is an evolution from public presentation of cultic rituals. So if you were in a Greek city back in, let's say, the 5th century or the 7th century, you might have saw some cults running around doing some different things in the streets. You might have seen processions, you might have seen them holding up really weird things or having acts played out, and you might not have really understood it, but it would have been fascinating to probably watch and just see what they were doing. Well, the tragic drama is usually a kind of a play that is performed not for the benefit of the gods or for the ritual, but just so that people can kind of listen to a story. If you think about why we watch TV now, people just want to be entertained. The major playwrights of the 5th century BCE are, here we go, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And there was comedies which are more funny and laughter oriented. Aristophanes, got him. All right, so that's the evolution of theater. Hellenistic philosophies, we have the Epicureans. The Epicureans believed solely in pleasure. They're distinct from hedonists because hedonists was more about doing what you liked for the sake of doing what you like. The Epicureans were more into pleasure if that meant that you could bring pleasure by helping other people. That's pleasure. Hedonist was more about yourself. If you want to punch somebody, you should probably punch somebody because that'll make you happy. Epicureans, not so much. Skeptics doubted the possibility of certainty in anything. There are many skeptics today, not in the classical Hellenistic philosophy sense, but people who are skeptic of aliens, or skeptic of we landed on the moon, or skeptic of global warming. You can pick something that people are skeptical about, and the skeptics doubted that we could really know anything. How can we know that the sun goes around the earth? Well, you don't know. You've never seen the sun go around the earth. You live on earth. For all you know, there's a guy in the sky carrying it with a chariot. You don't know. Stoics believed in duty and virtue and emphasis on inner peace. Their big goal was to not have emotion, to not show emotion. They believe you're supposed to do the right thing, do the virtuous thing, which means the best option, but you are not supposed to be swayed by emotion, by your heart, by your passions. You're just supposed to have this inner kind of calm within you, and getting rid of all kind of push towards tearing up your soul, basically.
What we do here is go back.